Hello, and welcome back to Sleepy History 5.00. Tonight, we are going to follow the long and fascinating story of the Goths, a people who moved across the edges of the ancient world, fought great empires, crossed enormous distances, and eventually helped reshape the history of Europe. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these long, quiet historical stories. It costs you nothing, and it helps us continue making peaceful journeys through the past. And do one more thing for me. In the comments, tell us where in the world you are listening from, and what time it is for you right now. Somewhere else, perhaps thousands of miles away, another person may be awake at this very moment, listening to the same story. There is something strangely comforting about that. Now settle in. Let your shoulders relax. Let your breathing become slow and easy. Put aside the worries of today, and allow your mind to drift backward through nearly 2,000 years of history. Our story begins around the year 100 AD. At this time, the Roman Empire stretched across much of Europe, North Africa, and the Mediterranean world. Rome was powerful, organized, and confident. Its roads connected distant provinces, its armies guarded enormous frontiers, and its emperors ruled over millions of people. But beyond the northern frontier, beyond the Roman forts and rivers, lived many peoples whom Roman writers described as barbarians. Among them were communities who would eventually become known as the Goths. We do not know exactly where the Goths came from. Their earliest history is wrapped in uncertainty, legend, archaeology, and later stories written down long after the events themselves. What we do know is that during the first centuries of the Roman era, Gothic-speaking peoples were living somewhere around the Baltic and northeastern European world. They were not yet the famous conquerors that later generations would remember. They were simply one of many peoples living beyond Rome's northern horizon. But slowly, over the centuries, they began moving south and east. And as they moved, they entered a world where the Roman Empire was growing richer, more powerful, and increasingly vulnerable. The Goths were about to step onto the stage of history, and their journey would eventually take them from the distant forests of northern Europe to the gates of Rome itself. For a long time, the Goths remained far beyond the Roman frontier, separated from the empire by rivers, forests, and countless smaller kingdoms and tribes. But the Roman world was never truly isolated. Trade crossed the frontier. Merchants carried metal, wine, pottery, and coins northward, while furs, amber, slaves, animals, and other goods moved south toward Roman markets. Through this contact, the peoples beyond the frontier slowly became familiar with the wealth of Rome. Roman coins began appearing in distant lands. Roman weapons and objects traveled far beyond the empire. And for communities living outside Rome, the empire became something more than a distant political power. It became a source of opportunity. During the 2nd and 3rd centuries, populations in northern and eastern Europe were changing. Groups moved, merged, separated, and formed new alliances. The Goths were part of this larger movement. According to a much later Gothic historian named Jordanes, the Goths remembered an ancient homeland called Scanza, which he associated with Scandinavia. But Jordanes wrote centuries after the events he described, so historians treat this story carefully. What matters is that by the 3rd century, Gothic groups were clearly established much farther south, near the Black Sea. And this was where their relationship with Rome began to change dramatically. The Black Sea connected many different worlds. Roman cities stood along its shores. Greek-speaking communities traded across its waters. Steppe peoples moved across the grasslands to the north. And Gothic warriors were now close enough to see the riches of the Roman provinces for themselves. The Goths were not one single, perfectly united nation. Instead, they were made up of different groups and leaders whose alliances could change over time. Some fought Rome, some traded with Rome, some served Rome, and sometimes the same group could do all three. Then, during the 3rd century, something changed. Gothic warriors began launching raids into Roman territory. They crossed rivers, attacked towns, captured prisoners, seized treasure, and returned with stories of the wealth that lay inside the empire. Rome responded with soldiers and fortifications, but the Roman Empire was entering a difficult period. Emperors rose and fell rapidly. Civil wars weakened the army. Enemies appeared along several frontiers at once. And in this dangerous world, the Goths discovered something important. Rome was powerful, but Rome could bleed. The first great Gothic wars were about to begin, and neither side yet understood how deeply these conflicts would change the future of Europe. He would not eliminate the Goths, but his victories helped restore Roman control over the Balkans. For a brief moment, the northern frontier became quieter, but the Goths were not disappearing. They were settling more permanently into the world around the Black Sea. And the next century would bring an even deeper transformation. The Goths would begin changing from raiders outside the empire into a people increasingly connected to Rome itself. He would not eliminate the Goths, but his victories helped restore Roman control over the Balkans. For a brief moment, the northern frontier became quieter, but the Goths were not disappearing. They were settling more permanently into the world around the Black Sea. And the next century would bring an even deeper transformation. The Goths would begin changing from raiders outside the empire into a people increasingly connected to Rome itself. In 376 AD, thousands of Goths gathered near the Danube. Behind them was the growing power of the Huns. Ahead of them stood the Roman Empire. For the Goths, crossing the river was not simply a military expedition. Many were families searching for safety. They brought children, animals, belongings, and whatever food they could carry. Roman officials eventually allowed them to enter imperial territory. The Goths crossed the Danube under Roman supervision. At first, this seemed like a manageable arrangement, but almost immediately problems appeared. There were far too many people to control easily. Roman officials were supposed to provide food for the newcomers, but supplies were limited. Gothic leaders complained that Roman officials were exploiting their situation. Some Goths were forced to sell their children into slavery simply to obtain enough food to survive. Resentment grew. The Roman authorities underestimated how desperate the situation had become. Then the Goths rebelled. What had begun as a request for protection turned into open war. Gothic warriors moved through the Balkans, gathering strength as other groups joined them. Roman armies were sent against them. But the empire was now facing a dangerous enemy inside its own territory. The Gothic forces knew the land. They were mobile, and they were fighting for survival. The Roman Emperor Valens prepared to confront them personally. His army marched toward Adrianople, a city in Thrace. Valens believed he could defeat the Goths and restore Roman authority. But the battle that followed would become one of the most famous disasters in Roman military history. On August 9, 378 AD, Roman and Gothic armies met near Adrianople. The Roman soldiers were exhausted after marching beneath the summer sun. The Goths formed their defensive position near their wagons. Then the fighting began. For hours, the battle remained uncertain. But eventually, Gothic cavalry returned to the battlefield at exactly the wrong moment for Rome. The Roman army became surrounded. Its formations collapsed. Thousands of Roman soldiers were killed. And somewhere on that terrible battlefield was the Emperor Valens himself. The Roman Empire had suffered a devastating defeat. The Goths had not conquered Rome, but they had proven something that could no longer be ignored. The empire could be defeated on its own soil. And the consequences of Adrianople would shape the history of Europe for generations. In 376 AD, thousands of Goths gathered near the Danube. Behind them was the growing power of the Huns. Ahead of them stood the Roman Empire. For the Goths, crossing the river was not simply a military expedition. Many were families searching for safety. They brought children, animals, belongings, and whatever food they could carry. Roman officials eventually allowed them to enter imperial territory. The Goths crossed the Danube under Roman supervision. At first, this seemed like a manageable arrangement, but almost immediately problems appeared. There were far too many people to control easily. Roman officials were supposed to provide food for the newcomers, but supplies were limited. Gothic leaders complained that Roman officials were exploiting their situation. Some Goths were forced to sell their children into slavery simply to obtain enough food to survive. Resentment grew. The Roman authorities underestimated how desperate the situation had become. Then the Goths rebelled. What had begun as a request for protection turned into open war. Gothic warriors moved through the Balkans, gathering strength as other groups joined them. Roman armies were sent against them. But the empire was now facing a dangerous enemy inside its own territory. The Gothic forces knew the land. They were mobile, and they were fighting for survival. The Roman Emperor Valens prepared to confront them personally. His army marched toward Adrianople, a city in Thrace. Valens believed he could defeat the Goths and restore Roman authority. But the battle that followed would become one of the most famous disasters in Roman military history. On August 9, 378 AD, Roman and Gothic armies met near Adrianople. The Roman soldiers were exhausted after marching beneath the summer sun. The Goths formed their defensive position near their wagons. Then the fighting began. For hours, the battle remained uncertain. But eventually, Gothic cavalry returned to the battlefield at exactly the wrong moment for Rome. The Roman army became surrounded. Its formations collapsed. Thousands of Roman soldiers were killed. And somewhere on that terrible battlefield was the Emperor Valens himself. The Roman Empire had suffered a devastating defeat. The Goths had not conquered Rome, but they had proven something that could no longer be ignored. The empire could be defeated on its own soil, and the consequences of Adrianople would shape the history of Europe for generations. After the disaster at Adrianople, the Roman Empire faced a difficult new reality. The Goths were still inside Roman territory, and the government could no longer simply force them back across the Danube. The Emperor Valens was dead. A new emperor, Theodosius I, took responsibility for the Eastern Empire and began searching for a solution. Theodosius understood that another enormous battle might cost Rome even more. So instead of destroying the Goths, he negotiated with them. In 382 AD, an agreement was reached. Large Gothic communities were allowed to settle within Roman territory, especially in the Balkans. They were not treated exactly like ordinary Roman citizens. They kept their own leaders and military traditions while remaining connected to the Roman state. The arrangement was unusual. The Romans hoped that the Goths could become useful soldiers and defenders. The Goths hoped that Roman lands would provide security and a stable place to live. For a while, the arrangement worked. Gothic warriors served in Roman armies. Some Gothic leaders gained wealth and influence. Young Goths grew up surrounded by Roman cities, Roman markets, and Roman culture. The boundary between Goth and Roman was becoming less clear. But peace did not erase old tensions. Gothic leaders still remembered the mistreatment their people had suffered when they first crossed the Danube. Roman officials sometimes distrusted the newcomers, and Gothic soldiers serving Rome could find themselves fighting other Goths. This created a complicated world where identity was no longer simple. A man could speak a Gothic language, follow Gothic traditions, serve a Roman emperor, and still consider himself proudly Gothic. The empire itself was changing too. By the end of the 4th century, Rome was increasingly divided between Eastern and Western centers of power. The Eastern Empire remained wealthy and powerful. The Western provinces were facing greater military and economic pressure. And among the Goths, a new generation of ambitious leaders was growing up. One of them would become famous across Europe. His name was Alaric. He was born into the Gothic world created by war, migration, and contact with Rome. And in the years ahead, Alaric would lead the Goths into one of the most unforgettable events in ancient history, the sack of Rome. As the 4th century came to an end, the relationship between the Goths and Rome became increasingly complicated. Many Goths now lived inside Roman territory. Some served in the army, while others farmed their land or traded in Roman towns. But peace was never completely secure. The Roman Empire itself was becoming divided between Eastern and Western rulers, and powerful generals often competed for influence. Among the Goths, a young leader named Alaric was beginning to rise. We know surprisingly little about his early life. He probably grew up in the Gothic communities of the Balkans, in a world where Roman and Gothic traditions existed side by side. Alaric eventually became a military commander. He served within the Roman political system, but he also understood the loyalty of Gothic warriors. This combination would make him extremely dangerous. In 395 AD, the Roman Emperor Theodosius I died. His death created a new period of instability. The empire was divided between his sons, and powerful officials struggled for control. Alaric and his Goths saw an opportunity. They moved through the Balkans, demanding payments and supplies from Roman authorities. The Roman government attempted to negotiate, but the situation remained unstable. Alaric did not necessarily want to destroy the empire. He wanted security, wealth, land, and recognition for his people. But Rome's leaders often viewed him simply as a rebel who needed to be defeated. Roman armies marched against the Goths. Sometimes Alaric was forced to retreat. At other times, Roman commanders negotiated with him and offered positions or payments. This pattern continued for years. Alaric would fight Rome, then negotiate with Rome, and sometimes even cooperate with Roman leaders. But every agreement could collapse again. The Western Empire was becoming weaker, and its armies increasingly depended on commanders from outside traditional Roman society. Goths were now serving as soldiers within the empire they had once attacked from beyond the frontier. The distinction between Roman and barbarian was becoming blurred. Yet Alaric remained determined to secure a better future for his followers. Eventually, his demands would take him farther west, toward Italy, and there, in the heart of the Roman world, the Gothic story would enter a completely new chapter. In the first years of the 5th century, Italy was becoming increasingly vulnerable. The Western Roman government had moved much of its political attention toward the city of Ravenna, where marshes and strong defenses offered protection from invading armies. But Rome itself remained the symbolic heart of the empire, and Alaric was now looking toward Italy. In 401 AD, Gothic forces entered northern Italy. The Roman government was alarmed. The Western Emperor Honorius was still young, and the real power behind the throne belonged to military commanders. One of the most capable was Stilicho. Stilicho gathered Roman forces and confronted Alaric. Several battles followed. The Romans managed to prevent Alaric from immediately taking control of Italy, but they could not completely destroy his army. Instead, negotiations began again. The Goths withdrew, but the underlying problem remained. Alaric wanted a secure position for his people inside the Roman world. He wanted land, money, and recognition. The Roman government wanted him gone. Neither side was willing to give the other everything it demanded. Then the situation became even worse. In 406 AD, large groups of Vandals, Suebi, and Alans crossed the frozen Rhine and entered Roman territory. The Western Empire was suddenly facing threats across several regions. Roman troops were pulled away from Italy to defend other provinces. Political rivalries also became more dangerous. Stilicho was eventually executed in 408 AD after being accused of treason. His death removed one of the few Roman commanders who had been able to negotiate effectively with Alaric. The Gothic leader saw his opportunity. He marched into Italy once again. This time, there was no strong Roman general capable of stopping him. Alaric demanded a huge payment and a formal settlement for his people. The Romans tried to delay. Alaric waited. Then he moved south. The Gothic army reached Rome. For centuries, Rome had stood as the center of the Mediterranean world. Foreign armies had rarely threatened the city itself. Now Gothic warriors were camped outside its walls. The people inside were frightened. Food supplies began to disappear. The Senate and Roman officials desperately searched for a solution. Alaric offered terms, but negotiations failed. The siege continued, and slowly, the unimaginable began to seem possible. Rome might actually fall. After nearly 800 years of Roman power, the ancient city was about to face the Goths at its gates. The siege of Rome continued into 410 AD. Inside the city, food became increasingly scarce. The Roman government struggled to find a solution, while Alaric waited outside with his Gothic army. Rome was still enormous and wealthy, but its famous walls could not solve the problem of hunger. Eventually, Alaric decided that negotiation was no longer enough. On August 24th, for 10 AD, Gothic warriors entered the city. Rome had fallen. The event shocked the Roman world. For centuries, Rome had represented power, order, and civilization. Even when emperors ruled from other cities, Rome remained a symbol of the empire itself. Now Goths were moving through its streets. But the sack was not the complete destruction that later legends sometimes imagined. The Goths remained in Rome for only a few days. They took valuables, supplies, and prisoners. Some buildings were damaged and some people were killed. But many churches and sacred places were spared. Alaric's goal was not simply to burn Rome to the ground. He wanted wealth and political leverage for his people. After 3 days, the Goths left the city. They moved south through Italy, hoping to reach North Africa, where the Roman government received much of its grain. But their plans suddenly changed. Alaric died later in 410 AD, probably in southern Italy. He was buried, according to a later tradition, near the Busento River. His death left the Goths without the leader who had guided them through years of war and negotiation. A new leader emerged. His name was Ataulf. Ataulf understood that the Goths could not remain forever as wandering warriors inside Italy. They needed a permanent homeland. He also understood that destroying the Roman Empire was not necessarily the answer. The Goths needed Rome. They needed Roman cities, agriculture, trade, and political recognition. So Ataulf began moving his people northward and westward. Eventually, the Goths crossed into Gaul. Their future would begin to take a different shape. The Goths, who had once lived beyond the Danube, were now establishing themselves deep inside the Western Roman world. They had fought Rome. They had served Rome. They had besieged Rome. And now they were preparing to become something neither side had originally imagined. A new kingdom built within the lands of the old empire. The Gothic settlement in southwestern Gaul gave the Goths something they had never possessed before: a stable base. Their new lands stretched around the region of Toulouse, where Gothic communities could farm, raise animals, and organize themselves without constantly moving from one place to another. But the Goths were still living inside a changing Roman world. The Western Roman government remained powerful in theory, yet its authority was becoming increasingly dependent on military commanders and local alliances. The Gothic kings understood this weakness. They could cooperate with Rome when cooperation was useful, but they could also act independently when Roman power declined. One of the most important Gothic kings of this period was Theodoric I. He ruled for several decades and helped transform the Goths into a stronger political power. Under his leadership, the Visigoths expanded their influence across southern Gaul and into Spain. But Theodoric was not simply an enemy of Rome. Like earlier Gothic leaders, he understood that Roman civilization still offered enormous advantages. Roman cities, roads, agriculture, taxation, and trade all remained important. The Goths increasingly adopted Roman customs while maintaining their own traditions and military identity. This mixture created something new. The Visigothic kingdom was neither completely Roman nor completely separate from Rome. It was a Gothic state living among Roman populations and using many Roman institutions. But another danger was approaching. The Huns had become one of the most powerful forces in Europe. Their leader, Attila, controlled a vast network of peoples and demanded tribute from the Roman Empire. By the middle of the 5th century, Attila began looking toward Gaul. The Roman government knew that the Huns could not easily be stopped by Roman soldiers alone. So an unlikely coalition began to form. Romans and Goths prepared to fight together. The old enemies were now standing on the same side. In 451 AD, the armies met on the Catalonian plains in Gaul. The battle was enormous. Romans, Goths, Franks, and other allies fought against Attila's Hunnic forces and their supporters. The fighting was brutal and confused. Theodoric I, the Gothic king, was killed during the battle. But the Gothic army continued fighting. The battle did not completely destroy Attila's power, but it prevented him from gaining control of Gaul. Only a few generations earlier, they had fought Rome as outsiders. Now they had helped defend the Roman world against one of its greatest enemies. But the Western Empire was already approaching its final decades, and the Goths would soon play an even greater role in its collapse. Another Gothic leader, Wallia, took power. Wallia quickly realized that the Goths could not remain independent everywhere they went. He negotiated with Rome. In return for food and a formal settlement, Gothic armies agreed to fight enemies of the Roman government in Spain. The arrangement worked. Gothic warriors attacked the Vandals, Alans, and other groups who had established themselves across the peninsula. For the Roman government, this was useful. For the Goths, it offered something they desperately needed: a homeland. In 418 AD, the Goths were given lands in southwestern Gaul. Their main center would eventually develop around the city of Toulouse. This settlement marked a major turning point. The Goths were no longer simply migrating from one region to another. They were establishing a kingdom. It was not fully independent yet. The Gothic king still operated within the Roman political system. But the foundations of what historians call the Visigothic kingdom had been laid. The people who had once crossed the Danube as desperate refugees were now becoming one of the major powers of Western Europe. And their greatest challenge was still ahead. For the Goths, it was a remarkable moment. After the death of Theodoric I, his son Thorismund briefly became king of the Visigoths. But Gothic politics remained unstable. The kingdom had grown stronger, yet powerful families and military leaders continued to compete for influence. Meanwhile, the Roman Empire in the west was becoming weaker with every passing decade. In 455 AD, the Vandals captured and sacked Rome. The event was another sign that the old imperial order was collapsing. The Visigoths watched these developments carefully. They were no longer simply one of many tribes living beyond Rome's frontier. Their kingdom was now an established power in Gaul and Spain. The Gothic kings increasingly acted independently. One of the most important was Alaric, who became king in 466 AD. Alaric was ambitious and understood that Roman authority in Gaul was rapidly disappearing. Under his leadership, the Visigoths expanded across large parts of southern and western Gaul. Roman officials could no longer effectively stop them. Cities and territories that had once answered directly to Rome now came under Gothic control. Alaric also expanded Gothic influence into Spain. By the late 5th century, the Visigothic kingdom had become one of the strongest states in Western Europe. Yet something extraordinary was happening at the same time. In 476 AD, the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was removed from power. The Western Roman Empire had effectively come to an end. But life did not suddenly change overnight. Roman cities continued to exist. Roman laws continued to influence governments. Latin remained the language of administration and culture, and former Roman provinces were now ruled by new kings. Among these new rulers, the Visigoths were especially important. They had not destroyed Roman civilization. Instead, they had become one of the peoples who inherited parts of it. The Gothic kingdom continued to use Roman administrative traditions while maintaining its own military structure and royal dynasty. This was the beginning of a new Europe. Part 13. By the beginning of the 6th century, the Visigothic kingdom controlled a large part of southern Gaul and much of Spain. But its position in Gaul was becoming increasingly dangerous. To the north, the Franks were expanding under their powerful king, Clovis. The Franks were different from the Goths in language and tradition, but both kingdoms wanted influence over the same territories. Clovis was also expanding his power rapidly. He had defeated several rival rulers and brought many Frankish groups under his authority. Now his attention turned toward the Visigoths. The Gothic king was Alaric II. He inherited a kingdom that was wealthy but surrounded by enemies. The Roman population within Gothic territory was largely Catholic Christian, while the Gothic ruling class followed Arian Christianity. This religious difference did not always cause conflict, but it gave Clovis an opportunity to present himself as a defender of Catholic Christians. The two kingdoms eventually went to war. In 507 AD, the armies of Clovis and Alaric II met near Vuil in Gaul. The battle was decisive. The Frankish army defeated the Visigoths. Alaric too was killed during the fighting. The defeat changed the future of the Gothic kingdom. The Visigoths lost most of their territory in Gaul. Their remaining lands were concentrated mainly along the Mediterranean coast, while their power in Spain became increasingly important. For the Franks, the victory was enormous. Clovis now controlled much of Gaul and had become the dominant ruler in the region. For the Goths, the situation was far more uncertain. Their kingdom survived, but its center of gravity shifted southward. The Visigoths began looking increasingly toward Spain. There, they still controlled large territories and important cities. But another power now became deeply involved in Gothic affairs: the Ostrogoths of Italy. Their king, Theodoric the Great, was one of the most powerful rulers of the age. He belonged to the other major Gothic branch and had established his own kingdom in Italy. Theodoric wanted to protect the Visigoths from destruction. After the defeat at Vuil, Ostrogothic armies intervened. For a time, this prevented the Franks from destroying the remaining Gothic kingdom. The Gothic world had now split into two great branches. The Visigoths ruled in Spain and parts of southern Gaul. The Ostrogoths ruled Italy. Both claimed the Gothic heritage, and both were about to face enormous changes as the Eastern Roman Empire prepared to intervene in the West. The two great Gothic kingdoms now stood on opposite sides of the Western Mediterranean. The Visigoths were rebuilding their power in Spain, while the Ostrogoths ruled Italy under their famous king, Theodoric the Great. Theodoric had grown up partly within the Roman world and understood its politics extremely well. Although he was a Gothic king, he respected Roman traditions. He kept Roman officials in important positions, supported cities, and maintained many existing laws and institutions. His kingdom was a mixture of Gothic military power and Roman administration. For a time, Italy experienced relative stability. Theodoric also tried to strengthen the Gothic position through diplomacy. Marriage alliances connected his family with several powerful kingdoms. The Gothic king wanted to create a balance of power that would protect Italy from outside threats. But far to the east, another Roman emperor was watching. His name was Justinian. He ruled the Eastern Roman Empire from Constantinople and dreamed of restoring Roman control over the lands that had once belonged to the Western Empire. To Justinian, the Gothic kingdom in Italy was not a permanent independent state. It was former Roman territory, and he intended to take it back. In 535 AD, Justinian's armies invaded Italy. The Ostrogoths fought back. What followed was a long and devastating war. Cities changed hands repeatedly. Rome itself was captured, lost, and captured again. The Gothic armies resisted fiercely, but the war destroyed much of Italy's wealth and population. The Ostrogothic kingdom was gradually weakened. Its leaders changed. Its armies became exhausted, and the Roman forces continued advancing. By 552 AD, the Great Gothic resistance was nearing its end. The Ostrogothic king Teia made a final stand against the Roman army in southern Italy. The battle was fierce. Teia was killed, and organized Ostrogothic resistance collapsed soon afterward. The kingdom that Theodoric had built was gone. But the story of the Goths was not over. The Visigoths still ruled much of Spain. Their kingdom had survived the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the rise of the Franks, and the wars of the 6th century. Yet Spain itself was changing. The Visigoths were gradually becoming more Romanized. Their kings adopted Roman laws and customs. Their language and identity slowly blended with the people they ruled. And eventually, another important transformation would take place. The Visigothic rulers would abandon Arian Christianity and officially embrace Catholic Christianity. That decision would help shape the future of medieval Spain. By the late 6th century, the Visigoths had lost most of their former lands in Gaul, but their kingdom in Spain was becoming stronger. Their main centers of power were cities such as Toledo, Merida, and Seville. The Visigothic kings ruled over a population that was mostly descended from the old Roman inhabitants of Hispania. This created an unusual society. The rulers were Gothic in origin, but Roman culture remained deeply influential. Latin was used in government and writing, Roman laws shaped daily life, and many Gothic kings adopted Roman customs. Yet one major difference remained. The Visigothic ruling class followed Arian Christianity, while most of the Roman population was Catholic. For generations, this religious division existed without completely destroying the kingdom. But it could create political tension. Then, in 586 AD, a new king came to the throne. His name was Reccared. Reccared understood that the religious division within his kingdom was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. In 589 AD, at the Third Council of Toledo, he publicly abandoned Arian Christianity and accepted Catholic Christianity. This was one of the most important decisions in Visigothic history. The Gothic king and the majority of his Roman subjects now belonged to the same Christian tradition. The change helped unite the kingdom. Catholic bishops gained greater influence in government, and the church became deeply connected with the monarchy. The Visigoths were also becoming less separate from the Roman population they ruled. The old distinction between Goth and Roman slowly weakened. Over time, Gothic identity became more closely connected with the kingdom itself rather than with a separate people living apart from Hispania. During the 7th century, Visigothic kings continued to strengthen their control over Spain. They fought rebellious nobles, dealt with foreign enemies, and issued new laws. The most famous legal collection was the Visigothic Code, which combined Gothic traditions with Roman law. The kingdom had become a genuine successor state to the Western Roman Empire. But beneath this appearance of stability, serious problems remained. Kings often depended on powerful nobles. Succession disputes were common. Rival factions competed for the throne. And when a king died, there was no guarantee that his successor would inherit peacefully. These internal divisions would eventually become disastrous. And when a king died, there was no guarantee that his successor would inherit peacefully. These internal divisions would eventually become disastrous. By the beginning of the 8th century, the Visigoths still ruled most of Spain. Their kingdom looked old and established, but beneath the surface it was fragile. And soon, armies from North Africa would cross the sea and change the story of the Goths forever. By the beginning of the 7th century, the Visigothic kingdom had become one of the most important powers in Western Europe. The old Gothic identity was still remembered, but the kingdom itself had become deeply connected with Roman Spain. Latin was the language of government, Catholic Christianity dominated public life, and Roman traditions influenced the laws of the kings. Yet the kingdom had one major weakness. Its kings were rarely able to establish a stable system of succession. When a ruler died, powerful nobles often competed for the throne. Sometimes a king was elected. Sometimes he was overthrown. Sometimes he was killed by his own rivals. This constant struggle weakened the monarchy. One of the most important kings of the period was Rexwinth, who ruled during the 7th century and helped establish a more unified legal system. Under Visigothic law, different groups had once been treated differently. Over time, however, the distinction between Goths and Romans became less important. The Visigothic Code brought together laws that applied to the kingdom as a whole. This was another sign of how completely the Goths had changed. 3 centuries earlier, they had arrived as a migrating warrior people from beyond the Danube. Now they were ruling a Romanized kingdom in Spain. Their kings lived in cities. Their bishops participated in government. Their laws were written in Latin. And their society looked increasingly like the other kingdoms that had grown from the ruins of the Western Roman Empire. But political instability continued. Noble families remained extremely powerful, and every royal succession could become a struggle. By the end of the 7th century, these divisions had become dangerous. Then, in 710 AD, King Witiza died. A new ruler named Roderick took the throne, but not everyone accepted him. Rival Gothic factions challenged his authority. At exactly the wrong moment, a new power was expanding across North Africa. The armies of the Umayyad Caliphate had reached the shores of the Western Mediterranean. In 711 AD, a Muslim army led by Tariq ibn Ziyad crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and entered Spain. The Visigothic kingdom was divided. Roderick gathered his forces and marched south. The two armies met near the Guadalete River. The battle would decide the fate of the Visigothic kingdom. And within only a few years, the kingdom that had ruled Spain for more than 2 centuries would collapse. In 711 AD, King Roderick marched south to confront the army that had crossed into Spain from North Africa. The invading force was commanded by Tariq ibn Ziyad, a Berber general serving the Umayyad Caliphate. Tariq's army was much smaller than the entire military strength of the Visigothic kingdom, but the Goths had a serious problem. They were divided. Some nobles supported Roderick. Others disliked him and may have had little interest in helping him keep the throne. When the two armies met near the Guadalete River, the fighting became fierce. The exact details of the battle are uncertain. Later sources describe several days of combat, but historians cannot reconstruct every event with confidence. What is clear is that Roderick was defeated. The Visigothic king disappeared during the battle, and the political structure of the kingdom began to collapse. Without a strong king, there was no easy way to organize a second large army. Tariq's forces moved quickly through southern Spain. Important cities surrendered or were captured. Córdoba fell. Toledo, the Visigothic capital, was eventually taken. The speed of the conquest surprised everyone. But the Visigothic kingdom did not disappear instantly. Some Gothic nobles continued to resist in different parts of Spain. Others made agreements with the new rulers and kept their lands. In the northern mountains, Gothic resistance survived. One of the most important figures was Pelagius or Pelayo, who became associated with resistance in the region of Asturias. The conquest also changed the political map of the Iberian Peninsula. The Visigothic kingdom, which had survived for generations after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, was effectively finished. Yet the Goths themselves did not vanish. Many continued living in Spain. Their descendants became part of the population of medieval Iberia. Their laws survived. Their churches survived. Their written records survived. And their memory continued to influence later Spanish rulers. The story that began centuries earlier among peoples north of the Roman frontier had now reached a remarkable turning point. The Goths had crossed rivers, fought emperors, entered the Roman Empire, sacked Rome, built kingdoms, adopted Roman culture, and ruled Spain. By 720 AD, their independent political power was largely gone. But their legacy was only beginning. After the fall of the Visigothic kingdom, the word Goth began to change in meaning. For centuries, it had described a people with their own leaders, armies, and political traditions. Now there was no independent Gothic kingdom ruling Spain. Yet the people themselves had not disappeared. Many Visigoths remained in the Iberian Peninsula and continued living alongside the local Romanized population. Some accepted the new Muslim rulers. Others moved northward. Some joined Christian resistance in the mountains. Over time, Gothic identity became less important than regional and religious identity. But the legacy of the Visigothic kingdom remained visible. Its laws continued to influence later Christian kingdoms. Church councils preserved records of Gothic kings and their decisions. Latin writers remembered the Gothic rulers who had once controlled much of Spain. And the name of the Goths survived in historical traditions long after their political power had disappeared. The story was very different in Italy. The Ostrogothic kingdom had already been destroyed by the Eastern Roman Empire during the 6th century. After years of war, the surviving Goths were absorbed into other populations. Some probably remained in Italy. Others may have moved elsewhere. Their kingdom disappeared, but their influence remained part of Italy's complicated post-Roman history. The Goths had therefore left behind two very different political legacies. The Visigoths had created a kingdom in Gaul and later Spain. The Ostrogoths had created a kingdom in Italy. Both had ruled former Roman territories. Both had adopted Roman institutions, and both eventually disappeared as distinct political powers. But their history tells us something important about the transformation of Europe. The fall of Rome was not a single event. It was a long process in which peoples from outside the empire entered Roman lands, fought Roman armies, served Roman emperors, adopted Roman culture, and eventually created kingdoms of their own. The Goths were one of the clearest examples of this transformation. They began as a people living beyond the Roman frontier. Centuries later, Gothic kings were ruling Roman cities and using Roman laws. Their story crossed the boundaries between barbarian and Roman, conqueror and citizen, outsider and ruler. And perhaps that is what makes their history so fascinating. The Goths did not simply destroy the Roman world. They became part of what came after it. The history of the Goths can sometimes seem like a story of endless movement. They appeared in the Roman world, fought its armies, crossed its borders, settled inside its provinces, and eventually ruled lands that had once belonged to Rome. But behind these migrations were ordinary people. Farmers planted crops. Families raised children. Craftsmen made tools and weapons. Merchants traveled between settlements. Warriors served Gothic kings and, at times, Roman emperors. The Goths were not simply an army marching from one battlefield to another. They were communities trying to survive in a changing world. Their original language, Gothic, was especially important. It was a Germanic language, and one of its most famous surviving records is the Gothic Bible translated by Bishop Ulfilas in the 4th century. Ulfilas was himself connected to the Gothic world and created a Gothic alphabet based largely on Greek and Latin letters, with additional influences from Germanic writing traditions. His translation helped preserve a remarkable piece of the Gothic language. The surviving Gothic Bible is one of the most valuable sources for any ancient Germanic language. But over the centuries, Gothic gradually disappeared as a spoken language. As Gothic communities became increasingly integrated into Roman society, Latin and local Romance languages became more dominant. In Spain, the Visigoths eventually adopted many Roman customs. Their kings used Latin. Their laws were written in Latin. Their church became Catholic. The Old Gothic language slowly faded. The same pattern occurred in other parts of Europe. Political kingdoms could disappear quickly, but cultural change often happened slowly. A Gothic warrior might still call himself a Goth while living in a Roman-style city. His children might speak Latin. His grandchildren might barely remember the language of their ancestors. This was one of the great transformations of late antiquity. Peoples who had once lived beyond Rome's borders were becoming part of the societies that emerged from the Roman Empire. The Goths were among the most important examples. Their story also reminds us how difficult it is to separate history into simple categories. There was no clear moment when the Goths stopped being Gothic and became Roman. There was no single day when Roman civilization ended. Instead, identities blended over generations. The Gothic kingdoms disappeared, but their people became part of medieval Europe. Their laws influenced later societies. Their kings remained in historical memory, and their name continued to echo long after the last Gothic rulers had vanished. By the early medieval period, the political world created by the Goths had almost completely disappeared. The Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy was gone. The Visigothic kingdom in Spain had fallen. Yet the memory of the Goths remained surprisingly strong. Roman and Christian writers continued to describe them in their histories. Some remembered them as dangerous enemies of Rome. Others recognized that Gothic kings had eventually become rulers of Roman lands and defenders of Christian society. One of the most important writers was Jordanes, who lived during the 6th century. Around the middle of that century, he wrote a history of the Goths known as Getica. Jordanes described the origins, migrations, wars, and kings of the Gothic people. His work is extremely valuable because much earlier Gothic history has been lost. But Jordanes was writing long after many of the events he described. Some of his stories came from older sources, while others may have been influenced by Gothic traditions and legends. Because of this, historians compare his account with archaeology, Roman writings, and other evidence. Even with these limitations, Jordanes helped preserve the memory of a people whose own written records were extremely limited. His history also gave later generations a powerful image of the Goths as an ancient and important nation. Centuries afterward, European scholars continued studying the Goths. Their name became connected with stories about the fall of Rome and the beginning of medieval Europe. But the real Gothic story was more complicated than the old image of barbarian warriors destroying civilization. The Goths fought Rome, but they also served Rome. They attacked Roman cities, but later governed Roman cities. They resisted Roman culture, but eventually adopted much of it. Their kings used Roman law and administration while maintaining Gothic military traditions. This mixture became one of the foundations of the post-Roman world. In that sense, the Goths were not simply the end of an age. They were also part of the beginning of another. Their kingdoms helped shape the political landscape from which medieval Europe emerged. And although the Gothic kingdoms disappeared, the transformation they represented continued for centuries. The Roman world was changing into something new. The Goths were one of the peoples who helped make that new world possible. Part 21. As the centuries passed, the Gothic kingdoms became memories, but their influence continued through the laws, stories, and institutions they had left behind. The Visigothic legal tradition was especially important. The Visigothic code, developed from earlier Gothic and Roman laws, remained influential in parts of the Iberian Peninsula even after the Visigothic monarchy had disappeared. It showed how deeply the Goths had absorbed Roman civilization. The same people whose ancestors had once lived beyond the Danube were now preserving Roman law in a kingdom of their own. Religion also transformed the Gothic world. The Goths had first encountered Christianity during the 4th century, partly through contact with the Roman Empire. Bishop Ulfilas played an important role in spreading Arian Christianity among many Goths. For generations, Gothic rulers followed the Arian faith while most Roman inhabitants remained Catholic. But this difference eventually disappeared. The Visigothic king Reccared converted to Catholic Christianity in 589 AD. The decision connected the Gothic monarchy more closely with the Catholic Church and with the Roman population of Spain. After that, Gothic kings worked closely with bishops and church councils. Religion became an important part of government. The old Gothic identity was changing again. The kingdom was no longer simply a Gothic military community ruling Roman subjects. It was becoming a Christian kingdom of Hispania. This transformation was gradual, but it was extremely important. The Goths had entered Roman territory as outsiders. Over several centuries, they adopted Roman law, Christianity, Latin writing, and many aspects of Roman culture. Yet they never completely lost their own traditions. Their kings remained symbols of Gothic authority. Their warriors continued to form an important part of the military elite. Their laws preserved memories of older customs. This mixture of cultures was one of the defining features of the post-Roman world. And it was not unique to the Goths. Franks, Burgundians, Lombards, and other peoples were also building kingdoms across former Roman territory. Europe was becoming a patchwork of new states. Some were short-lived. Others survived for centuries. The Goths had been among the first major groups to make this transformation visible. Their journey from the northern frontier to the center of former Roman territory was therefore much more than a story of conquest. It was a story of adaptation. They changed as they moved. Rome changed because of them, and the world that emerged from their meeting would eventually become medieval Europe. By the 7th century, the Visigoths had become deeply rooted in the society of Hispania. The old distinction between Gothic rulers and Roman inhabitants was fading. People of different backgrounds lived under the same laws, followed the same Catholic faith, and increasingly shared the same culture. The Visigothic kings continued to rule from Toledo, which had become the political heart of the kingdom. Toledo was more than a royal city. It was also a major center of the Catholic Church. Bishops gathered there for councils, where they discussed religion, law, and political matters. These councils show how closely the monarchy and church had become connected. But beneath this organized society, the kingdom remained politically fragile. The Visigothic throne was not always inherited peacefully from father to son. Powerful nobles could choose kings, support rivals, or overthrow rulers they disliked. This created a cycle of instability. A strong king might temporarily control the nobles, but after his death, old rivalries could return. The problem became especially serious near the end of the 7th century. The kingdom faced military challenges, political divisions, and disagreements among powerful families. When King Witiza died around 710, rival factions competed for control. Roderick eventually became king, but his position was contested. The Visigothic kingdom was divided at exactly the moment when a new military power was approaching from North Africa. In 711, Tariq ibn Ziyad crossed the Strait of Gibraltar with an army. The Visigoths were not prepared for such a rapid invasion. Roderick gathered his forces and marched south. The resulting battle near the Guadalete River ended in disaster for the Gothic king. Roderick disappeared, and the kingdom's central authority collapsed. Within a short period, major cities fell. Toledo was captured. The Visigothic royal government ceased to function. Yet some Gothic nobles continued to resist. In northern Spain, Christian communities survived outside Muslim control. Pelagius became associated with one of the earliest centers of resistance in Asturias. From these northern regions, Christian kingdoms would eventually grow. The Visigothic kingdom was gone, but its political traditions did not vanish completely. Its laws, church traditions, and memories continued to influence the kingdoms that followed. The Goths had ruled Hispania for more than 2 centuries. Their kingdom had risen from the ruins of Rome, and even after its fall, pieces of that world remained scattered across the peninsula. By the year 720, the political world of the Goths had changed almost beyond recognition. The great Gothic kingdoms were gone. The Ostrogothic kingdom had disappeared in Italy during the wars of the 6th century, while the Visigothic kingdom had fallen in Spain after the invasion of 711. Yet the Gothic story was not simply a story of defeat. For more than 6 centuries, the Goths had remained connected to some of the most important events in European history. Their churches preserved Christian traditions that had developed during the Roman centuries. Their cities continued to use roads, buildings, and administrative systems inherited from Rome. Even after the Gothic kingdoms disappeared, these institutions continued. The word Goth itself also survived. Medieval writers continued to remember the Goths as an ancient people. Later European historians studied their migrations and wars. Their story became part of the larger history of the transition from the ancient world to the medieval world. But perhaps the most interesting part of Gothic history is how difficult it is to define exactly where their story begins and ends. The Goths of the 1st century were very different from the Visigoths of Spain. The Ostrogoths of Italy were different from the Gothic communities around the Black Sea. And the people who descended from these groups eventually became part of larger European populations. There was no single moment when the Goths simply disappeared. Instead, their identity slowly blended into the societies they had helped create. By 720 AD, the Gothic kingdoms were gone, but their laws, memories, traditions, and influence remained. And that is why the history of the Goths still matters. They were not merely the people who helped bring down Rome. They were also among the people who helped build the world that came after it. They had entered the Roman world as outsiders. They had fought Roman armies along the Danube and Black Sea. They had crossed into the empire as refugees. They had defeated Roman forces at Adrianople. They had marched through the Balkans and Italy. They had entered Rome in 410. They had established kingdoms in Gaul, Spain, and Italy. And eventually, they had adopted many of the traditions of the civilization they had once challenged. Their journey reveals how dramatically Europe changed after the height of Roman power. The Roman Empire did not simply disappear and leave an empty space. Instead, its territories were gradually transformed by new kingdoms. The Goths were one of the most important peoples involved in that transformation. Their kings often ruled Roman populations using Roman officials and Roman law. Their armies contained warriors from many different backgrounds. Long after the Gothic kingdoms disappeared, their story continued to influence how Europeans understood the end of the ancient world. For ordinary people, life centered on harvests, trade, taxes, religion, and the safety of their homes. The great migrations of kings and armies were only one part of their lives. This is important when thinking about the Goths. They were not a single army that suddenly appeared and destroyed Rome. They were communities that changed over generations. Some remained near the Black Sea. Others entered the Roman Empire, becoming soldiers, farmers, or servants of Roman emperors. Eventually, Gothic rulers governed cities that had once been controlled directly by Rome. Their relationship with Rome was never simple. The Goths admired Roman wealth and organization, but they also wanted independence and security. Roman emperors feared Gothic armies, yet they also needed Gothic soldiers. Even the sack of Rome in 410 did not mean that the Goths wanted to erase Roman civilization. Alaric and his followers wanted wealth, land, recognition, and a secure future. The Goths adapted to the Roman world while also changing it. Their kingdoms preserved Roman administration, worked with Roman elites, and continued imperial traditions. Their laws eventually combined Gothic customs with Roman legal ideas. This blending became one of the most important features of late antiquity. By the time the Visigoths ruled Spain, the old image of the wandering Gothic warrior was already fading. The Gothic kings were now monarchs of a settled kingdom. They ruled cities, issued laws, negotiated with bishops, and maintained armies. It showed that cultures do not always replace one another completely. Sometimes they merge. The Goths entered Roman history as outsiders. They left behind a legacy deeply connected to Rome. Their story was not simply about the fall of an empire. It was also about the creation of a new Europe from the pieces of the old one. The story of the Goths also reveals how much of their history was shaped by geography. The lands around the Black Sea connected Europe, the Mediterranean, and the Great Eurasian Steppe. Peoples could move across these regions with surprising speed, and political changes in one area could affect communities hundreds of miles away. When the Huns moved westward, Gothic groups were forced to make difficult choices. Some resisted, others submitted. Many sought protection inside the Roman Empire. That migration changed the relationship between the Goths and Rome forever. Once inside the empire, the Goths were no longer distant neighbors. They became part of Roman politics. Their warriors could serve Roman emperors, while their leaders could negotiate directly with imperial officials. But the empire struggled to control them. The disaster at Adrianople in 378 showed that Gothic armies could defeat a Roman field army. Afterward, Rome increasingly relied on diplomacy as well as military force. The Goths gained land and political influence. In return, Rome hoped they would help defend the empire. This arrangement worked for periods of time, but it never completely solved the underlying tensions. Alaric's rise demonstrated the problem. He was a Gothic leader operating inside a Roman political world, yet he was never fully accepted as an ordinary Roman commander. His demands for land, payment, and recognition repeatedly brought him into conflict with Roman authorities. When negotiations failed, he marched into Italy. In 410, his army entered Rome. The event became one of the most famous moments in ancient history, yet the Gothic occupation lasted only a few days. Afterward, the Goths continued searching for a permanent home. Eventually, they established themselves in Gaul and Spain. Their identity began changing again. They were no longer migrants searching for safety. They were rulers. Their kingdom became increasingly Romanized, and their kings adopted Roman law, Christianity, and administrative traditions. Over generations, the boundaries between Goth and Roman became less important. The Gothic story was therefore not simply a journey from north to south. It was a journey from separation to integration. And by the early 8th century, that process had gone so far that the independent Gothic kingdoms had disappeared, even though their legacy remained woven into the history of Europe. The Gothic kingdoms had changed dramatically by the time they became established in the Western Roman world. For generations, the Goths had been remembered as outsiders, migrants, and warriors moving across the borders of Europe. Now, some of their leaders ruled territories that had once belonged to Rome. But ruling a kingdom was very different from leading a migrating army. The Gothic kings needed more than soldiers. They needed administrators, laws, taxes, cities, and officials who understood how the Roman world worked. This meant that Gothic rulers increasingly depended on Roman traditions. In Gaul, the Visigoths established a kingdom centered around Toulouse. Their kings maintained their own political identity, but they also governed Roman populations who had lived in the region for generations. Roman law and administration continued to influence everyday life. The same transformation occurred farther south. In Spain, Gothic power gradually expanded until the Visigoths became the dominant political force across much of the peninsula. Their capital eventually moved to Toledo. There, Gothic kings ruled over a population that was overwhelmingly Roman in language, culture, and daily habits. The distinction between conqueror and conquered slowly became less clear. A Gothic warrior might carry a Germanic name while living in a Roman city. A Gothic king might rule according to traditions inherited from Rome. A Roman official might serve a Gothic monarch. The old boundaries were fading. Religion also played an important role in this transformation. Many Goths had originally adopted Arian Christianity, while most of the Roman population in their kingdoms followed Nicene Christianity. This religious difference created tension. But eventually, Gothic rulers recognized that religious unity could strengthen political unity. In 589, King Reccared of the Visigoths publicly converted to Nicene Christianity. The decision marked a major turning point. The Gothic king was no longer simply ruling over a Roman Christian population. He was becoming part of its religious world. Over time, councils of bishops and royal officials worked together to create laws that applied across the kingdom. The Gothic kingdom was becoming something new. It was neither the old Gothic society nor the Roman Empire. As the Western Roman Empire weakened, the Gothic kingdoms became more important. The Visigoths had established themselves in Gaul, but their ambitions did not end there. Their attention increasingly turned toward the Iberian Peninsula, where Roman authority had become weaker and political struggles were creating opportunities for new powers. Gothic armies entered Spain several times. At first, their presence was connected to wars and alliances with other rulers. But gradually, the Visigoths became more permanently established. Cities that had once answered to Roman governors now came under Gothic control. The transformation was slow. The Visigoths did not simply destroy Roman society and replace it with something completely different. Instead, they inherited much of what already existed. Roman roads continued to connect important settlements. Roman cities remained centers of administration and trade. Roman landowners continued to cultivate their estates, and Roman laws remained influential. The Gothic rulers understood that they could not govern such a large territory using military force alone. They needed the cooperation of local elites. They also needed a system of laws that could govern both Goths and Romans. Over time, Gothic kings began issuing laws that reflected both Gothic traditions and Roman legal practices. One of the most important developments came under King Leovigild during the 6th century. He strengthened royal authority and expanded Visigothic power across much of Spain. He also attempted to reduce the differences between Gothic and Roman populations. Yet religion remained a major obstacle. Most of the Roman population was Catholic, while the Gothic ruling class was largely Arian. This division created political and social tensions. Leovigild's son, Reccared, eventually chose a different path. In 589, Reccared converted to Catholic Christianity at the Third Council of Toledo. The conversion was a major turning point in Visigothic history. The Gothic monarchy now shared the religion of the majority of its subjects. Bishops became increasingly important in political affairs. Church councils helped shape laws and royal decisions. The Visigothic kingdom was becoming more unified. The old distinction between Gothic rulers and Roman subjects was slowly fading. A new society was emerging. It was Gothic in political memory, Roman in many cultural traditions, and Christian in its religious identity. This mixture would become one of the foundations of medieval Spain. But the kingdom remained vulnerable. Powerful nobles continued to compete for the throne. Kings could be overthrown by their own supporters. Succession disputes weakened central authority. By the beginning of the 8th century, these internal divisions would prove disastrous. The Goths had spent centuries adapting to a changing world. They had crossed borders, entered the Roman Empire, fought Roman armies, established kingdoms, and adopted many Roman traditions. Yet their greatest challenge was still ahead. The world they had helped create was about to change once again. By the beginning of the 8th century, the Visigothic kingdom had become one of the most important powers in the Iberian Peninsula. Its capital was Toledo, where kings, nobles, bishops, and officials gathered to govern the kingdom. From the outside, the kingdom appeared strong. But beneath the surface, political divisions continued to weaken it. The Visigothic monarchy did not always pass smoothly from father to son. Powerful nobles could support different candidates, and rival groups sometimes fought for control of the throne. This created instability at exactly the moment when a new power was approaching from the south. Across the Mediterranean, Muslim armies had expanded rapidly during the 7th and early 8th centuries. They had conquered large parts of North Africa and eventually reached the shores opposite Iberia. In 711, an army led by Tariq ibn Ziyad crossed the Strait of Gibraltar. The Visigothic king Roderick moved south to confront the invading force. The two armies met in a battle that would change the history of Spain. The Visigothic army was defeated. King Roderick disappeared from the historical record soon afterward, and resistance across the kingdom began to collapse. The Muslim armies moved rapidly through the peninsula. Many cities surrendered rather than fight. Some local rulers negotiated agreements that allowed them to keep their lands in exchange for recognizing the new authority. Within only a few years, most of the former Visigothic kingdom had fallen. For the Goths, this was the end of an independent kingdom that had lasted for generations. Yet the conquest did not erase the population overnight. Gothic nobles, Roman-descended families, farmers, soldiers, and townspeople continued living in the peninsula. Some accepted the new rulers. Others fled northward. In the mountainous regions beyond the main centers of conquest, Christian resistance gradually developed. One of its early leaders was Pelagius, traditionally associated with the beginning of the Kingdom of Asturias. Centuries later, Christian rulers in northern Spain would look back to the Visigothic kingdom as part of their heritage. The memory of the Goths became politically useful. Kings could claim that they were continuing the traditions of an earlier Christian kingdom. But the reality was more complicated. The Visigothic world had already been deeply transformed by Roman civilization. Its people were no longer simply the migrants who had crossed Europe centuries earlier. They had become part of the changing population of Spain. Their kingdom had fallen, but their influence did not disappear with it. Laws, religious traditions, royal memories, and historical writings continued to survive. The Goths had entered Roman history as outsiders. Now, even after their kingdom disappeared, they remained part of the foundation of medieval European history. After the fall of the Visigothic kingdom, the Gothic name did not disappear from Europe. The political kingdom was gone, but memories of the Goths remained alive in churches, manuscripts, laws, and stories. In northern Spain, Christian rulers continued to resist Muslim expansion. Some of these rulers looked back to the old Visigothic kingdom for legitimacy. The memory of the Gothic kings became connected with the idea of a lost Christian kingdom that had once ruled the peninsula. But elsewhere, the Gothic past was remembered differently. Writers in medieval Europe often described the Goths as fierce warriors who had played a major role in the destruction of the Western Roman Empire. Their name became associated with the dramatic transformation of the ancient world. Yet this image was incomplete. The Goths had not simply destroyed Rome. They had lived within Roman society for generations. They had served Roman emperors, fought Roman enemies, adopted Christianity, used Roman laws, and eventually ruled Roman populations. Their story was therefore part of the transition between the ancient and medieval worlds. Even the Gothic language left an important historical record. The most famous surviving Gothic text was the Bible translated by the Bishop Ulfilas in the 4th century. Only fragments of this translation survive today, but they provide historians with valuable evidence about the Gothic language. Through these fragments, scholars can reconstruct parts of a language that disappeared many centuries ago. The Gothic language itself gradually faded as Gothic communities became integrated with larger populations. In Spain, Latin and its developing Romance languages became dominant. In Italy and other regions, Gothic communities were absorbed into local societies. The people did not suddenly vanish. Instead, their separate identity slowly weakened. This process was common throughout post-Roman Europe. Tribes and kingdoms that had once appeared completely different gradually mixed with the populations they ruled. Names changed, languages changed, religions changed, political loyalties changed. Over generations, the old distinctions became difficult to recognize. There was also another Gothic community that survived far longer. In Crimea, descendants of Gothic groups continued to live for centuries after the Western Gothic kingdoms had disappeared. Known as the Crimean Goths, they preserved a separate identity in the Black Sea region. Their history reminds us that the Gothic world was much larger than the kingdoms that appeared in Italy, Gaul, and Spain. The Goths had once been spread across a huge area of Europe and the Black Sea region. Their migrations connected distant parts of the continent. Their wars helped reshape Roman politics. Their kingdoms helped create the political landscape of medieval Europe. And their memory continued long after their kings were gone. The Gothic story was therefore not a simple rise and fall. It was a long process of movement, adaptation, conquest, and assimilation. The people changed as the world around them changed. And eventually, the Goths became part of the Europe they had helped create. The story of the Goths had begun centuries earlier, when ancient communities lived along the northern edges of the Roman world. Over time, those communities moved southward and eastward, crossing rivers, entering new lands, and forming connections with other peoples. Their early history remains difficult to reconstruct. Much of what we know comes from Roman writers, archaeological discoveries, and later traditions. Yet one thing becomes clear: the Goths were never a completely isolated people. They were part of a constantly changing world. They traded with Romans. They fought Roman armies. They adopted foreign customs. They absorbed other groups. And they were themselves transformed by every migration and conflict. When the Huns moved westward, Gothic communities were divided between those who resisted and those who sought protection within the Roman Empire. The arrival of the Goths inside Roman territory created tensions that eventually contributed to the disaster at Adrianople in 378. Later, under leaders such as Alaric, Gothic warriors became major players in Roman politics. In 410, Alaric's army entered Rome. The event shocked the Mediterranean world. But even then, the Goths were not simply destroying Roman civilization. They were searching for a secure place within a collapsing political system. Eventually, Gothic kingdoms appeared in Italy, Gaul, and Spain. The Ostrogoths ruled Italy under Theodoric the Great. The Visigoths established a kingdom that eventually became centered in Spain. These kingdoms preserved many Roman institutions while maintaining their own traditions. This mixture became one of the defining features of the post-Roman world. The Gothic kingdoms eventually disappeared. The Ostrogothic kingdom was destroyed during the wars of the 6th century. The Visigothic kingdom fell after the Muslim conquest of Iberia in the early 8th century. The Gothic language also disappeared. But the Goths themselves did not simply vanish. Their descendants became part of the populations of the regions where they had settled. Their laws influenced later societies. Their churches survived. Their stories were copied. Their name remained in European historical memory. Perhaps the most important lesson of Gothic history is that peoples do not always disappear when kingdoms fall. Political borders can vanish within a generation, but cultural influences can survive for centuries. The Goths began as a people on the edge of the Roman world. They became enemies of Rome, allies of Rome, soldiers of Rome, and eventually rulers of former Roman lands. Their journey crossed much of Europe and connected the ancient world with the medieval one. By the time the Gothic kingdoms disappeared, the Europe that emerged was very different from the Europe the Goths had first entered. Rome had fallen in the west. New kingdoms had taken its place. Christianity had become central to European society. And the Goths, once outsiders on Rome's frontier, had become part of the foundation of this new world. Their story was not simply the story of a people who disappeared. It was the story of a people who changed and helped change Europe with them.